We're here at Black Hat 2019. I am here with the unicorn and Bryson Bort, the founder and CEO of Scythe. Bryson, welcome.
Welcome to my show, Mr. Asadorian.
If you were a Bond villain, would your name be Grimm?
Would it
Professor
be
Grimm?
Professor Grimm. Professor Grimm. Has a little bit of a ring. I never thought of myself as an academic.
Right?
I always, liked to do things.
It seemed you would fit the evil professor role, I think, very, very well.
Well, why is
Very
it?
well.
Is it the eyebrow?
It's just the demeanor.
The demeanor?
The level of intelligence coupled with the demeanor. Professor Grimm.
Well, I can fake intelligence when we're recording these things and then re-recording them. Like, this is what, our sixth take?
Well, it's good to have you here and do an interview live with the unicorn as well. We wanted to talk about some of your research and talks in the IoT space. I think we've got similar experience in that we looked at vulnerabilities and different methods of attack, talked about them, and then, lo and behold, years later, we're like, oh, yeah, look at that. Attackers are doing that today. And you've got a similar story.
Yeah. So 2 RSAs ago, I put together a talk called No IOUs for IoT. Because, 50% of a talk is the name, and that's what they accept you on. And then they're like, yeah, he wrote words or something. And I gave this talk at B-Sides Las Vegas last night. But what was kind of like the scripted for it was that just this week, the Russians were disclosed with their hands in the cookie jar doing the exact TTP that I've been talking about for the past 2 years. So, Boris, I'm watching you. I want royalties on that. And what they did is there were 3 classes of IoT devices that they hacked into, because where I was going with my talk is it's not the IoT device itself that most folks care about. Right? There's nothing really interesting on it. There's not a lot it can do unless you have lots of them, AKA what happened to Brian Krebs, where he was DDoSed across 1 million devices from a mass compromise. And that's the start for the talk, is I show how easy it is to get lots of devices. Because as an attacker, it's just surface area to start. I just want to begin somewhere, and I don't always necessarily care depending on what it is. Obviously, the Russians were probably a little more targeted, but kind of more the shotgun blast of what can I get in that sort of space. So what they did is they compromised these 3 classes of IoT devices and then used them to laterally pivot with traditional computer network operation offensive techniques into traditional IT enterprise, where there are things of interest, right? That's the data that I really want.
No, they weren't doing anything difficult, such as creating their own firmware for the device and trojaning it and then uploading it. That was some of my things I talked about, because I liked the Hollywood script kind of style behind that. It'd be really cool if I could modify the firmware and then trojan it and then replace it, and then the user would use the IoT device. They'd have no idea, but I'd secretly be listening. It's not even that complex.
Not even that complex. And I was just thinking of our personas here. The next time I come on Security Weekly, I'm going to have to wear wire rim glasses for Professor Grimm.
Yes, Professor
And you
Grimm.
Clearly have the Hollywood glasses.
These are my Hollywood glasses. Yes.
No, that's the thing. You don't even have to be that clever. If you look at the threat landscape of what we've seen, these are consumer devices with mostly consumer-grade security, and that statement alone is pretty much an oxymoron.
Right.
And so the biggest attacks that we've seen have worked because most IoT devices ship with default credentials. So here's something you don't monitor. The consumer's definitely not paying attention. There's no lockout if I try to log into it too many times. So there's, kind of like 10 default password combinations of user ID and password. And
most devices today, because I think they're more powerful, you do end up with a shell. I feel like 10, 15 years ago, getting an actual shell, it wasn't even included on the device because it was so small. But today, that's possible.
Yeah, I get shell. They have a communications protocol of some type. I love it when I get TCP/IP, because that makes it much easier for me to do those kinds of things. In the case of the Russians, they did TCP dump, which of course was available because I had that. That's there. And so as they've gotten increasingly more sophisticated, slightly more sophisticated, they now do have those kinds of things that start to bleed a little bit more into the traditional offensive operations, and I can take advantage of those. And so what we showed in, that first kind where I'm gaining access to get that shell with default credentials, and then the other part of it is the fact that, and you can go on GitHub. right? I actually show this as a part of my talk. Go on GitHub and just look for proof of concept for IoT vulnerabilities. So these are, folks out there who probably have responsibly disclosed it, but there were 28,000 commits that I found.
Wow.
So you don't even have to know what you're doing. Just copy somebody's code.
Yep.
Make sure it matches the device. And oh, by the way, Census or Shodan that will do that for me. So I get the exact firmware, I get the device, and I go, does this match this? It does. Drop the proof of concept that I'm on. I've got shell, right? I didn't even have to do anything other than just establish a connection to your IP to be able to do that. And you're on, right? So with no technical talent, you can actually take over all of these devices. And then it's just a simple script to run and be like, well, what can I see? Because I have that capability that's on that device to see what other things are on it.
And basically have a Linux box on their internal network.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So now I've got Linux. It's not running Kali. It's running some
You're limited, sure, depending on the device. Yep, yeah.
Some janky Linux that, probably was built by somebody who doesn't even exist anymore.
You could probably go on GitHub and find binaries for that. Yep. You don't even have to cross-compile, which makes me want to tear my eyeballs out. You can save that step.
That's called convenience, Paul.
Right. Go on GitHub and just pull the binary and upload it, and now I'm off to the races.
Yeah. So people don't patch these things. People aren't monitoring these things, and they're out there with incredibly vulnerable to both of those approaches. And again, once you're on, you now have this enhanced capability to go back to your traditional penetration testing, red teaming, or nation state offensive operations.
I mean, very easy to hit file share, start probing the domain, right?
And that's what I do. That's what I do in my talk. Is I just start doing that, and then from there, in the particular demonstration, I do an end-day exploit, and I'm able to get the password decrypted. I then just do dictionary-style attacks against the file shares that I see with combinations of that password, because most folks don't change it.
Yep.
And at that point, I'm on. And
some devices even have information about the domain, like a printer sometimes will have information about the domain, so I don't even have to scan and broadcast. Like, it's just there for me to look at.
Absolutely. And so again, consumer environment, nobody's looking at it. Enterprise environment, theoretically folks are, but usually they get a little bit confused when IoT devices are starting to do these things because they do it a little bit differently, and then it just sort of is ignored. And that's I try to go into that talk with a lot more detail on the enterprise response, both at a policy and a technical level of what you have to do to really understand that piece. It's like we're going back to the 80s, and let's start figuring out everything that's going on our network again.
And I always said, like, with an IoT device, like a printer or whatever it is, it doesn't have a monitor, mouse, keyboard. There's no user sitting in front of it. There's typically not very good logging. It's not being monitored like a server or a container process even, right?
Not at all.
It's just kind of there. And no one, like you said, no one's really paying attention to it. It's the perfect playground for attackers.
And that's why I've been demonstrating that for the past 2 years until the Russians got using the techniques I was talking about.
Yeah. Now, in your space, in breach and attack simulation, right, and from defenders in general, like, how do we deal with the IoT, this device that we've basically just established as it's there and no one's paying attention to it? How do we get people to pay attention to it? What do they need to do?
So this fits nicely with our hypothesis. As the IoT device itself is, it has no organic value, right? I'm not doing anything on the device of interest. It's what I do from the device that's of interest.
Right.
And so I classify that into the way that I look at the whole kill chain of the problem from a defensive perspective, which is fundamentally me being on an IoT device in your environment is the same thing as me having gotten initial access to anywhere else in your environment. So from that view, just looking at it conceptually, it doesn't matter, right? I haven't accomplished anything as an attacker yet just because I've exploited a desktop that's not my final destination, or that IoT device or whatever, because at the end of the day, I land, I try to figure out where I am I safe? And then I start looking at what's of interest. What do you have that meets what I want to do?
Right.
And
so it's more about detecting and preventing the lateral movement than it is the initial infection. I mean, that's really what security is about today, because we know attackers are going to get in somehow, some way, if they're persistent enough. And it's about detecting that lateral movement or preventing it.
And
or modeling it.
Yeah, or modeling. Well, we don't just model it, we show it.
It's not even a model, right? You actually do the lateral movement so you can understand how this would happen.
Yes, and this is where I saw us as a unique solution in the breach and attack simulation space is One, I mean, this goes from the couple of decades of real offensive experience that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Several of the folks on my team have worked for me in those places before,
Mm-hmm.
and we've been doing this for real for a long time. And so it was really fun to kind of be like, oh, let's just do this commercially.
Right. Right.
And that's where our platform is different. Is this thing is going to come in and it's going to work just like a real attacker.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be able to build itself up. It's going to be able to modify itself. It's going to be able to look around and take the information so that it can move through your environment to what's of interest from that adversary's perspective that you're simulating.
Yep.
It's not modeled, right? We're simulating in the production environment to see where does it get to something of interest.
Right. And how does it get it out?
And how does it get it out? Because we need once I've got on that box, the clock starts ticking for measuring the metric to when the security team
Yep.
can identify what's happening. And every time I'm doing something, I'm providing that data point to be able to determine that.
Yep.
And so as this thing's moving through, those are, it's building up the log of where you should have first identified and figured that out, just like a real red team.
Yeah.
Only this case, it's able to be doing it against, concurrently against the entire enterprise all at once
Right.
through a common operations
And you've added
portal.
some more automation for that lateral movement recently too.
Yeah.
Right. So you could basically like script the attack once you get in and laterally move.
Yeah, so we'd already had a lot of the capabilities to support lateral movement through different kinds of escalation of privileges and techniques for that, credential theft, mimikatz. There were a lot of ways that were already there on the platform, but what we did in response to user demand is we actually built an automated workflow for that when you're building out the synthetic malware that you want to test with. And so the user can now sit there and be like, all right, well, I want it to be able to, once it does this, I want it to be able to take this information, then try to do that, and then try to worm its way through. So it will then laterally move itself, right? I'm going to use that successfully over here. And the other fun part that I like is it now includes what we call a battlefield visualization. So you can see the whole network of compromised hosts and how you're able to move through it and what it's doing at each point visually through
That's awesome.
the console.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, because I think a lot of us, whether you're red team, blue team, right, you're like, well, I read about or someone told me about once they got in, they did this and mimikatz and then this and this and this. Now you can just string that together and go, yeah, see what that looks like on my network.
Yeah, that's where I think we are bringing a real purple solution to the market, right?
Yeah.
We came from the red and the offensive side, but there's a significant benefit and a way of bringing that collaboration that we've talked about always about how do attack and defense play together. Well, in this case, what you build up here on the attack side, you can share that directly through the same platform so that the blue team afterward has that malware with all those things built in to now go, okay, well, let's test this as we continue to try to figure out how do we refine our detections. Did these controls work? Like I can continue to do that. And then the other,
I like it. It's kind of like agile development, but for your infrastructure.
Absolutely, and that's another area where we see kind of like it even sort of a little bit further out there is imagine DevOps now being able to include that as a part of the testing for what they're going to be releasing, right? The part that needs to work is this thing needs to be easy enough to use that I, as a developer, don't want to understand all the intricacies or make this thing hard to use, right? I just want to be given, here's some specifications, here's a binary, what happens, right? I click the binary and I see what happens, or I inject the DLL and I see what happens, right? Like from my view, very simple things, and all of what it does is just baked into it, so I don't have to worry about it. It's like running an automated regression test, only with offensive synthetic malware.
Well, yeah, I mean regression testing for security, which is important. I mean, I feel like everyone should. I wish I had that in my DevOps chain right now. I'm working on building it. Maybe we should talk after after this interview. So
after I finish compromising your webcam, I'll do that.
Okay, perfect. macOS support is included now.
Yep.
So now you got Windows, Linux, and Mac covered. That's awesome. And if people want a demo or a trial, they can go to, is it securityweekly.com/Scythe? That's the works. Scythe.io. Right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean, direct to Scythe.io. We like our tech to speak for itself. I mean, as much fun as it is to get the dog and pony show.
Right.
I think it's no better than we'll give a free trial and.
That's right. You do have a free trial.
We do free trials.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
No, we like the tech to speak. I mean, we've created. We're the only folks on the planet who've built this right now. We keep looking. We haven't seen anybody else who does just-in-time compiled synthetic malware to specification.
Yep.
And so that's a strange concept, and more folks are starting to get it, and
Mm-hmm.
we're building a customer base, and we have more customers, as you and I were joking
That's
before. He's like,
awesome.
you're like, what's different? I'm like, well, now we have more people paying, and you're like, well, what's going to be next?
More people.
More,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
So
good.
we've already, we're getting onto a couple of hands and toes of folks who use this regularly, and pay for it. But going back to the point, we want you to play with it,
Yeah,
right?
just
Free trial,
go.
try it out.
Right.
And I think the most common use case we get is because what can I do in 2 to 4 weeks when you already have a full job and you're doing all these other things? Typically, folks are already there's some procurement for some other security
Mm-hmm.
application or something or appliance, and they use our platform to validate it.
Right. Yeah.
And so
Okay.
our platform has become the most common trial we've seen is folks doing bake-offs using our platform to see what works or doesn't. And the best part about that is it's not like a lab setup of here's some artificial things that we're going to run to test if this EDR does this or does that. They can employ it in their environment under their own configurations and
Mm-hmm.
see what happens on
Right.
the host and network at the same time.
It's awesome. Bryson, thank you so much for coming on Security Weekly.
Thanks, man.